After months of waiting, I've finally gotten my hands on BMW's all-new 2020 Z4. This is BMW's latest Roadster, and it's designed to compete very directly with the Mercedes-Benz SLC and the Porsche 718 Boxster. But this is also a direct competitor to the Toyota Supra, and we should talk about the elephant in the room right up front. The long and short of this is that the Z4 would not exist without Toyota, and the Supra would not exist without BMW. BMW said that there was no financial case to build the Z4 because sales are relatively low. This is a two-door Roadster. That's not a really hot selling segment in the world right now, especially in the United States. But Toyota also wanted to create a two-door sports car, the new Toyota Supra. So Toyota said, hey, how about I give you some cash? You can design the basics of the vehicle and then we'll build a Supra off of the parts that you develop. And that's exactly what happened with the Z4. So this is 100% BMW and the Toyota Supra is 98% BMW. So although you will definitely find a lot of BMW under the hood of the new Toyota Supra, we find absolutely no Toyota under the hood of this vehicle. But on the BMW balance sheet, there's definitely a lot of Toyota cash that went into this design. For some reason, a lot of folks have been upset about the Toyota-BMW partnership, and to be perfectly honest, I don't understand that, because without Toyota's money, the Z4 wouldn't have existed. And without the Z4 being designed, the Toyota Supra wouldn't exist. So sports car fans now have two different vehicles to choose from, one with a rag top and one without, and if it wasn't for this particular tie-up, you wouldn't have any. Up front, this definitely looks like one of BMW's classic Roadsters. We have the long hood proportion here, the classic BMW grille, obviously modernized for 2020, full LED headlamps over here, and well-integrated front parking sensors. All these are functional air intakes because the model that we're taking a look at today is the M40 Eye. From the side profile, you can see that we have very classic Roadster proportions, much like the Mercedes-Benz SLC. The driver and front passenger are sitting practically on top of the rear axle. That gives that great sense of fun out on the road that Roadsters are known for. And then, of course, we have the long hood proportion that we've come to expect from BMW in their sleeker cars. That's because we have an inline-six engine under the hood, and it needed all that room in order to fit under there, but it also really gives the Z4 this absolutely gorgeous profile from the side. The engine location is also what causes the Z4 to look quite different than something like the Porsche 718 Boxster, because it is a mid-engined vehicle. The engine is behind the driver and passenger, and then there is a very small trunk behind that. Out back, we see a little bit of BMW 4 Series and perhaps a little bit of 8 Series as well. There's a spoiler integrated right there into the trunk lid. We have a Z4 logo over there, M40 Eye on this side, and then dual exhaust tips down at the bottom. Now, why is this an M40 Eye rather than a Z4M? Well, this is part of BMW's M Performance line, not the full-on M line. So this is the same sort of differentiation we see between the BMW M340i and a BMW M3. At this point in time, I can't be sure that there's ever going to be a full-on Z4M in the United States for this generation. However, it wouldn't surprise me if BMW does give us one. Somewhat surprisingly, these vents right here at the rear of the vehicle are not functional, although the ones way up front, right there behind the front wheel, are. As with many BMWs in America, the Z4 is available with either a 2-liter turbo or a 3-liter turbo. The 2-liter produces 254 horsepower, and this 3-liter inline-six produces 382. It's worth noting that that is notably more power than we find in the Toyota Supra, which gets a 335 horsepower tune of nearly the same engine that we find under here. You'll go 0 to 60 in 5.2 seconds, according to BMW, if you get the 2-liter engine. This one drops that down to, theoretically, 3.9. At the moment in the US, the Z4 is available only with an automatic transmission, an 8-speed ZF-sourced unit. But if you live in Europe, you can get a 6-speed manual. Rather unfortunately, it only comes with a 197 horsepower engine. So if you want this level of power anywhere in the world, you're going to end up with the automatic. Two-door vehicles like the Z4, even from luxury companies, often end up being a little bit of a compromise when it comes to overall comfort. That's because for vehicles like the SLC, the Z4, and the Porsche 718, performance is an important consideration in addition to overall comfort. That's logically because for vehicles in this category, the Z4, the SLC, and the Porsche 718, overall performance is definitely still important. Therefore, lightweighting the vehicle is important. If you were to look at more expensive two-door vehicles, then there tends to be a little bit more of a focus on overall luxury. We still have a very comfortable driver's seat, however, with a 4-way adjustable lumbar support, inflatable bolsters, and a manually extending thigh cushion right there up front. And the passenger seat has the same range of motion as the driver's. We have a manual tilt telescopic steering column because it's a little bit lighter than a powered unit. A nice touch that we see in a number of luxury convertibles, the soft top goes into a separate compartment for the trunk. So whether the top is up or the top is down, we have the same amount of cargo space in the Z4. Let's go for a quick spin around the interior now. We have fixed headrests for the driver and front passenger. There's a little cutout right there around the nape of your neck to allow a little bit of ventilation. We have the rollover prevention system right here, a removable wind deflector right there between those two posts in the back. And then we have speakers behind the driver and front passenger seats for the surround sound audio system, and then subwoofers back there as well. We also find a ski pass-through right here. Now what's interesting about this is if I open this up, you'll notice there's another little door right behind there. So you can use that as a little bit of a storage cubby, or you can drop that other door from the trunk, and then you can put long items from that area right here into the cabin. We then have a little bit of a cargo divider right there. And depending on how tall you or your front passenger are, this does extend over there behind the seats, so you could put a little bit of cargo right there behind the driver or front passenger seat. As you'd expect from a BMW, the front doors are made from entirely soft touch materials. We have the stitched components up there and in the middle, and then more slush molded plastics down there at the bottom, right down there around that very small little cubby down there below the speaker grill. I didn't find that terribly useful. A lot of things seem to fall out of there. The stitched materials continue as we move on over to the dashboard. We have a very small bin-style glove compartment. I was not able to fit a tablet computer inside. I know a lot of folks have been asking this, but no, the Supra and the Z4 do not share very many interior components. The main reason for that is that the Supra pulled a lot of parts out of BMW's older parts bin, and the Z4 gets a lot of BMW's latest components. So we find the latest version of BMW's iDrive system right here on the dashboard, Apple CarPlay integration as you can see right there, the typical iDrive apps, vehicle settings right here, driver profiles, vehicle status, the same sort of screens that we see in every other BMW out there. Below the infotainment system, we also find BMW's latest climate controls, very similar to what we see in the BMW X5 and X7 right there for the dual zone system. We then have controls for the infotainment system down here, volume, mode, band, and then these are preset buttons that can be programmed in the system. Then there's a track forward, backward button for the passenger to use. Between the footwells, we find a storage cubby right there that has a wireless charging mat. CarPlay is wireless in the Z4 just as we see in other BMW models, so there's no need to use the single USB input. It's a small area where I suppose you could store keys and a 12-volt power outlet. We then get basically the same controls that we see in other modern BMWs. The same basic shifter design with an unlock button over here. We pull back for drive, pull over to the left for the manual or the sport mode, and then press the button right down there at the bottom for park. You'll find the controls for the BMW iDrive system to the right of the shifter, and then controls for things like the parking sensors, traction stability control, and the auto start stop enable disable button over to the left. This is also where we find the engine start stop button. And then continuing down, we have the drive mode buttons, Sport, Comfort, Eco, Pro, and Adaptive. There's also an auto brake hold button down there at the very, very bottom, electric parking brake, and the button to actuate the power top. As we see in a lot of Roadsters, space is definitely at a premium in here, so this center console doubles not only as a storage area, but also where you find the cup holders. Well, this is obviously less practical than the cup holder location in something like the BMW 4 Series. This is definitely more practical than the cup holders that we see in something like the Miata. And you can tell that the Germans were definitely thinking about driver comfort while using the cup holders, because the driver's side of this top can be closed while you're using the cup holders. Unfortunately, the passenger side cannot. That's why they're a little bit offset. On the driver's side, we have a full LCD instrument cluster, also similar to other BMW models that we've seen recently. We have a tachometer over here on the right side, and then the speedometer over here on the left. There's also a moving map display right there in the middle. This display is not as configurable as some of the competition's full LCD displays, but you can see that we do have a few different readouts over there on the right side, and the mode does change a little bit based on the overall drive mode that you're in. For instance, if we go to the Eco Pro mode, you'll notice we get a miles per gallon gauge right over here on the right side instead. The steering wheel is a thickly rimmed design. We have paddle shifters on the back and aggressive sport grips up top. You'll find the buttons for the cruise control system over here on the left side of the steering wheel, the button for the heated steering wheel on the bottom spoke, and then the controls for the infotainment system over here on the right. Since this vehicle has a heads-up display, you can use this button right here and the roller on the steering wheel to control the heads-up display functions. You can also use that to scroll along through your playlists on your media device. The next thing you're going to notice is the acceleration from this inline-six engine. The Z4 is an awful lot of fun. And as I said before, the driving position is going to be very different than the average luxury convertible out there, because the front wheels are far in front of me and the back wheels are practically right under my rear end. Speaking of performance, we went 0 to 60 in this model in 3.9 seconds. That's exactly what BMW says you'll get. We had a little bit of rear wheel slip, so I suspect that if you were on better pavement, you could get just a hair faster than that 0 to 60, but not too much more. That might surprise some of you because BMW is known as a company that tends to underestimate their 0 to 60 times. When this model Z4 initially launched, BMW said it would go 0 to 60 in 4.4 seconds. That was their typical conservative number. Rather unfortunately, that plan was disrupted by Toyota launching the Supra and saying, hey, our Supra is a little bit faster than the claimed number for the Z4. So BMW went back to the drawing board, and instead of giving us a very conservative number, they've given us a more realistic number in terms of 0 to 60. In terms of the competition, that puts this model on very similar footing to the Porsche and the Mercedes competition, and definitely a little bit faster than the rest of BMW's convertible lineup that uses the same engine under the hood. So if you're looking at a 4 Series convertible, you decide you don't really need the back seats, you should know that this is going to go faster 0 to 60 than that 4 Series model and be more fun to drive out on the road. In our braking tests, this model took just 102 feet to stop from 60 miles an hour back to 0. You can thank the relatively wide and grippy tires that we have on this model and the light curb weight of the Z4. As you'd expect out of a BMW Roadster, handling is absolutely excellent, and I'm going to give that an A+ in this model. We do have summer tires on this particular Z4, and of course this is the M40 Eye version, so definitely keep that in mind. Handling is not going to be quite up to the same level if you get the base engine in the Z4. Aside from the handling ability that we generally get from a lighter curb weight in a Roadster, one of the other things that's so much fun about this kind of car is the fact that I'm sitting practically on the rear axle, so it feels like the car is pivoting around you in place. This has a very different handling feel overall than your average 4-seat convertible that you find in the luxury segment. This is definitely more engaging, more fun, and I really love the long hood proportion up front. It just adds to the overall experience. Even though the Z4 has an adaptive suspension, when we get out on a rougher road like the gravel road that we're on here, this is still fairly firm, even in the comfort setting, which is the softest setting the suspension has. If you're looking for a Roadster that has a more relaxed personality, then you're going to have to look at something like the Mercedes-Benz SL, or of course their AMG GT. Your other alternative, of course, would be to give up the power that we find in this model, get something like the Z4 with the 2-liter engine, and that is going to be tuned on the softer side. When it comes to the overall ride score, I'm going to have to give this model a B-. This could be considered a daily driver if you live in an area where the roads are better paved than the roads around where I live, and I'm not just talking about this gravel road here, I'm talking about the paved roads as well. Out on the road, one of the first things you'll notice is that this power retractable top can be operated up to about 30 miles an hour or so. That makes this an awful lot more convenient than some hard top designs where you have to come to essentially a complete stop in order to lower the top. Back out on the paved road, everything just comes together for the Z4. The way the suspension feels, the way the steering feels, etc. This is a very, very fun car to drive. Now, admittedly, if I put this into the sport mode out here on this winding mountain road, then you can definitely feel all the minor imperfections coming into the cabin, because again, this is the more performance-oriented version of the Z4. In our cabin noise testing, we got 74.5 decibels in here at 50 miles an hour. You can thank the fabric top for that. That was with the top completely closed. If you're looking for a convertible with a quieter experience on the inside, then you would want to look at a hardtop convertible. But again, one of the advantages for this soft top is that if I want to raise the soft top, all I have to do is go down here to about 30 miles an hour. I don't have to come to a complete stop, and I can just close the top right there. There's no other trunk lid or anything like that to wait for, and then we can just scoot off into the distance. And that's not something that you can do in a hardtop convertible. When it comes to fuel economy, I'm going to go ahead and give this a B. We have been, of course, driving this pretty hard because it is such a fun car to drive, and that's the biggest reason that we've been averaging just 22 miles per gallon. If you were to treat this vehicle more gently, put it in EcoPro more often, then you'll definitely be getting overall better fuel economy, especially out on the highway, where vehicles like this with BMW's inline-six engines generally do very well. Bottom line, the Z4 is an awful lot of fun out on the road. Now, is it as much fun as the Porsche 718? I would say no. It's just due to the overall weight balance. I like that lighter front-end feeling that we find in modern Porsche vehicles. This is going to have a more classic rear-wheel drive feel to it, with the weight up front, the power in the back, and we get a slightly different feel in that Porsche, where the weight and the power are both in the back. This is very different than something like the Audi TT, which of course has the weight and the power up front. Now that said, although I prefer the way the Porsche feels when you're driving it out on a track or you're driving it at 9/10, I have to say that if I were going to select a vehicle, I would probably buy this over the Porsche. Pricing is part of that, we'll cover that in just a moment here, but the rest of it is that I prefer the more predictable driving nature of a vehicle with more weight up front. It may not be quite as much fun, but I think overall this is just more appropriate for me. And of course, at the moment, if you're contemplating the Mercedes-Benz SLC, I would say you should definitely get one of these instead. The SLC just doesn't feel as modern, doesn't feel quite as tight or together based on its general age, and this is a brand new Roadster design. Now let's get to the nitty-gritty. If you want a Z4, you'll have to be willing to spend at least $49,700. That gets you the base 4-cylinder turbocharged engine. That'll get you 0 to 60 in 5.2 seconds. If you want the M40 Eye model that we were driving, that'll be at least $63,700, and that's what gets you 0 to 60 in just under 4 seconds. 5.2 seconds 0 to 60 is not too far off of where most of the competitors land, but the M40 Eye is notably quicker than the vast majority of the direct competition to the Z4, whether we're talking about a Supra or even certain entries from Porsche. Since there are so many different options that you can add to your Z4, we're just going to dive right into the competition here, and the first and obviously most direct competitor to the Z4 is going to be the Mercedes-Benz SLC. If you're not familiar with the new Mercedes-Benz naming scheme, the SLC is the artist formerly known as SLK. So the SLC 300 is the SLK with the 2-liter 4-cylinder engine. That starts just under $49,000 and gets you 0 to 60 a little bit slower than the Z4 at 5.8 seconds. That little bit slower continues as we move on up the line. So the SLC 43 AMG, just about $64,000 or so, will get you 0 to 60 in 4.6 seconds. That is 0.7 seconds slower, according to the manufacturer, than the M40i. And even if the SLC 43 beats that time by a little bit, as we typically see in the Mercedes lineup, it's still going to be notably slower than the M40i. Outside of these two options, if you want a front-engine rear-wheel drive Roadster, you can choose between the Nissan Z and a Mazda MX-5 Miata. Neither of those is really quite the same thing as a Z4 and SLC. But then the SLC and Z4 really aren't quite like one another necessarily either, because the SLC is a hardtop convertible and the Z4 is a soft-top convertible. So you have to decide exactly what you're looking for here. The hardtop has the disadvantage of being a little bit heavier, but it has the advantage of being quieter on the inside. And we definitely see that when driving these vehicles back to back. We get less wind noise in the cabin of the SLC. But the SLC is not quite as fresh as the Z4. It has been around a little bit longer, and even though the interior is put together very well, it doesn't feel as new and as modern and as stylish as what we see in the new Z4. I've said it before and I'll say it again, I really love the AMG engine that they're putting in the 43 models. That is an absolutely excellent turbocharged 6-cylinder engine. And I have to say, I think I like it just a little bit more than the inline 6 that we see in a lot of modern BMWs. It has an incredibly good sound to it, and I really love the power figures that we see out of that engine. Unfortunately, I think it is let down a little bit by the Mercedes automatic transmission. I have to say that I like the 8-speed automatic that we see in the BMW a little bit better. So overall, I have to say I prefer the drivetrain that we see in the M40i. And then the rest of the package put together is what gets that M40i 0 to 60 in under 4 seconds. The M40i also feels a little bit more sorted on rougher roads and just feels a little bit more modern overall. Again, you'd expect that because it is the newer model. And you would logically expect the next time the Mercedes-Benz SLC gets redesigned that it's going to then leapfrog the Z4 in terms of refinement, interior design, etc. But at this exact moment, I have to say that the SLC comes in just a step below the Z4 for me. Next up, we have the other German entry, which really is unlike these other two, and that is the Audi TT. Although the Audi is about the same size overall as the Z4 and the SLC, it's a very different kind of vehicle because it has a transverse engine up front, not a longitudinal engine, and it is based on a front-wheel drive platform design, even though the TT comes only with all-wheel drive in America. So in terms of overall relationships, the TT is more closely related to a Golf R than something like an Audi A4, A5, A6, A7, A8. That relationship causes some folks out there to look down a little bit on the TT, but the Audi is quite simply the best handling front-wheel drive vehicle that you can buy. Handling in the TT is absolutely incredible, and if you drive it back-to-back with comparably equipped models from the other German competitors, you would be honestly very, very surprised in what you can do with a transverse-mounted engine. The TT is also a little bit less expensive. It starts at about $45,500 for the base model. That gets you to 0 to 60 in about 5.2 seconds, so right about the same overall 0 to 60 time as the Z430i. But of course, it'll be doing that at around $4,000 less expensive or so. It's also going to do that with a slightly bigger trunk, and that's thanks to that transverse engine design. We don't have that same proportion in the TT that we see in the Z4 or the SLC. That is the one downside. So we don't have that really long hood proportion with a short, tight body behind it. Instead, we have a slightly more practical, more rational layout where we have a shorter hood, the body behind it, and then we have a slightly longer trunk lid in the back, and we have more cargo space, even though the vehicle overall is about 5 inches shorter. It's just because a transverse engine platform is a little bit more efficient. Audi's 7-speed dual-clutch transmission is one of the best in the industry, and if you want to go faster 0 to 60 than 5.2 seconds, you can do that in the TT. This is one of the few options that will get you there. That would be the TT RS for just about $67,000. So definitely still within the price range of the M40 Eye, and that will get you 0 to 60 in a very blistering 3.6 seconds 0 to 60, thanks to a really cool turbocharged 5-cylinder engine and basically the same 7-speed dual-clutch transmission. Now on the downside, at the moment, it does not look like the TT RS Roadster is going to come to America. So if you want the TTRS, you're going to have to get the hardtop version. So if you want the extra horsepower in the RS model, you're going to have to go for the 2-door coupe, not the 2-door convertible. Then, of course, there's the wild rumor that Audi may be canceling the entire model period. So if you want an Audi TT, you probably better act quickly within the next year or two because it may not continue after the 2022 or perhaps the 2023 model year. Now, personally, I really hope that it does because the Audi, again, really proves that you don't need a longitudinal platform and rear-wheel drive to have absolutely mind-blowing, incredible handling. The TT handles incredibly well. I really, really like the TT. Now, on the downside, the interior is feeling a little bit less fresh than what we see in the Z4, and if you want to have rear-wheel drive style antics, you're just not going to be able to do that in the TT. On the other hand, we do have good grip, we have that all-wheel drive, absolutely incredible handling, but does come across as the slightly more pragmatic alternative in some ways. You're not going to be able to do donuts in your TT. That brings us along to another option that's, again, not quite like the rest of the options here, the Porsche Boxster. The 718 Boxster starts at $59,000 approximately. That will get you 0 to 60 faster than the Z430i, about 4.9 seconds, according to Porsche. And then you can get your Boxster all the way on up to about 3.94 seconds, 0 to 60, depending on exactly which numbers you believe. But it's going to cost you quite a lot of money. You're going to need to get the GTS or the Spider in order to go the fastest in your Boxster model. Those are going to be the ones down there right around 3.8 to 4.0 seconds. $71,000 only gets you a 4.4 second 0 to 60. Now again, Porsche, like BMW, typically Mercedes often, etc., tends to underrate their vehicles, so it's likely that for $71,000 your Boxster may be a little bit quicker than 4.4 seconds 0 to 60. However, it's still going to be more expensive for that overall level of performance versus the BMW. Now, the reason that Porsche calls it a mid-engine design rather than a rear engine is that there is a trunk behind the engine in the rear of the vehicle, and that's what helps push the weight a little further up front than, for instance, the Porsche 911, where the engine is definitely right back there just in front of the rear bumper. Anyway, you slice it, that gives you the more classic Porsche driving dynamics of having more weight in the rear, so the front end is going to be a little bit more willing to turn, but on the flip side, it means the car is going to be better balanced than a 911. So a lot of folks like the way the Boxster and Cayman drive because of that slightly more balanced dynamic. You still get the slightly lighter front end, it's a little bit more willing to turn in, but you also still have a slightly better balance than what we see in the 911. So slightly more predictable handling when things really start going wrong. On the downside, all those Porsche 911 fans are going to look down on you. A lot of people out there will insist that they bought the Cayman or they bought the Boxster because of driving refinement and that slightly better weight balance. But other folks out there that own 911s are just going to say, you bought that because you couldn't afford a 911. And there is probably a little bit of truth in that statement. With that bombshell out of the way, let's move on, of course, to the elephant in the room, which is the all-new Toyota Supra. The Toyota Supra and the BMW Z4 were co-developed at the same time. You can think of this as sort of the hardtop version of the Z4, but the relationship is a little bit tricky. The relationship is more and closer than an Audi TT and a Golf R, but not quite as close as a Porsche Cayman and a Porsche Boxster. To create the Supra, Toyota obviously had access to BMW's parts bin, but the parts they chose are a little bit different than what we see in the Z4. So for instance, the iDrive system in the Supra is not the current version that we see in the Z4. It actually is about one generation behind. I do think that's a little bit of a pity. There's also the fact that the Z4 is a roadster, the Supra is a hardtop. Toyota tweaked the suspension on the Supra to make it feel a little bit different than the BMW. It has a slightly more direct feel out on the road. I wouldn't say it's quite Lexus-like, but it is definitely more towards the Lexus side of steering tuning than what we typically see in BMW models. And then, of course, there's the Supra's value and performance. We get nearly M40i kind of performance for a price tag that is more similar to the 30i. Similarly, along that vein of value, we have access to Toyota's dealer network with the Supra, and that could be a big deal to some folks out there because there are just more Toyota dealers in the United States than there are BMW dealers, so you're more likely to have one nearer to you when you do need service on your Supra. On the downside, of course, it's not a BMW. It doesn't have a BMW logo on the front, so even though it's built by BMW, it doesn't say BMW on the outside. Some may see that as a pro, but a lot of people will see that as a con because you're going to be paying luxury car money for a vehicle with the Toyota logo on the front. So what would I get if my own money were on the line? Well, I have to admit that I'm really torn. If the TT-RS was available as a roadster in America, I probably would buy it, I think, over the Z4. It's a little bit quirky, it's a little bit different. I really love the handling. I love the way that 5-cylinder engine sounds, but it doesn't exist here yet at the moment. And I have to say that if I were going to buy a car in this fun to drive category, I would want one that's topless. So the Z4 wins for me here. It's a lot less expensive than a comparably equipped Porsche. It may not be quite as much fun to drive as a Boxster, but it's less expensive, better value going on in the BMW. It also feels a little bit more modern in some areas than the 718 as well. With that out of the way, let me know what you would get if your cash was on the line. Would you get something like a Supra because it is an incredible value? The Supra could be $15,000 to $20,000 less than some configurations of the BMW M40i. And if you're interested in modifying your vehicle, especially if you're in that kind of crowd, then the Supra could be a better deal really than the Z4 because you're going to pay less for the Supra, and if you modify it, you could get power outputs that are definitely above what we see in the Z4 M40i. Let me know all that down there in the comment section below, and of course be sure and head over to facebook.com/AlexNautis so you can see what we're driving this week. I'll see you later.